The idea is assimilation good, right? That's sort of the way we thought about it. So we have these measurements. Why? How is it, right? So I had a gentleman ask me once, why is it that we talk about third generation as third generation immigrants and not just as American or US citizens, right? And that's why, right? It's because we're trying to measure assimilation. And we assume that some people make the assumption or make the argument that the more English they speak and the less connected to their native tongue, the better off they are, right? But we have actually research to the contrary as well, right? So it's a lot more complicated picture. We look at indices in terms of median household incomes, right? So the idea, high school graduation rates, college enrollment, college graduation rates. So the idea is very sort of American dream, right? Who's sort of accomplishing the American dream? And we use those measurements. But it becomes a complicated picture. I'll give you an example. The model minority, right? People often talk about Asian Americans as the model minority. That came out of the 60s because it became the notion of labeling Asian Americans model minorities was to then point at other immigrants or point at African Americans, the black community, and say, what's wrong with you, right? How come you can't advance like this other group of minorities who are doing quite well? But when you actually tease out the numbers, it's much more complicated than what it seems, right? So if you look at Asian Americans, for example, they have very high SES, socioeconomic status, when you look at the indices in the census in terms of how much money the households make, right? But when you break out the numbers, you actually find that the household income in many of those households is because you have multiple generations of adults working, right? So that when you actually break it out, the numbers aren't as high as they seem. And sometimes the stereotype like model minority will hide the poverty that exists in some of these communities, right? Or the racism that Asian Americans, for example, might experience.
Dowell?
Well, let me piggyback on what you're just saying right there. There's an interesting paradox I've noticed in my research. You know, Asians have the highest achievement level of most of our immigrant groups as a group, but turns out Latinos assimilate faster. Interesting difference. And it turns out that the Asians arrive with a high education level.
Assimilation defined as what?
Well, Asians arrive with high education, they arrive with high wealth, and so that we think they're assimilated. They're not, they just arrive that way. And ironically, it's actually the low-skilled Mexican immigrants who assimilate the longest and highest because they actually do it the old-fashioned European way. They progress over time, where Asians don't progress as much over time. So it's a paradox. And so if you think someone of high status is assimilated, that's not the meaning of assimilation. Assimilation is a transformation over time. And so I think Asians over time do transform also, but it's not as visible because they start off at a higher level in indicators.